G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today we're going to be looking at the Old World Almanac. It's an article that was put out on Warhammer Community for the 2nd of January, and it talks about the different factions and a lot of the fluff, the lore, things going on in the background. And I want to dissect it and just talk about it from my, I was going to say cynical, but we'll just say realistic perspective, because that's how I truly see it. So, in this, we are getting these sort of as our main starting factions, and I don't expect that to change based on what I read in this article, because they very much play it down as certain factions in this game, such as the vampire counts. They're like, look, the vampire counts, the Von Carstones are completely shattered after, recent battles that have occurred in this time. It's like, yes, that's true, but in my mind, it's like there are plenty of other vampires that are not just Von Carsteins. Blood Dragons, Necrarchs, Strigoi, Lamians, all those other bloodlines that are very interesting. So they could do something around any of those, because they all pose threats in their own different way. But it seems to be that they don't want to do anything focused around the sort of vampire counts. You also notice that the Dark Elves and Illustria, or the Wizard Men, are missing. Again, I think that's because of the area they want to focus this game around. They're basically explaining it in such a way in this article, it's almost like a Horus Heresy setting, as in, hey, this is a different period in time, and because this is a different period in time, there are certain factions that just have no impact on the wider world, and therefore they've just dramatically played down those factions, which is very interesting to me. I also noticed that demons are not represented here unless they're tied into the Warriors of Chaos, or the Beastmen Brayherds, nor do I see the Chaos Dwarves, which are my own personal army, and actually make a lot of sense in this time period, because they are hanging around, obviously, and are definitely not depleted or weakened in strength. Now, another interesting thing in this article they talk about is Cetra. Now, Cetra in the article, they point out that he's basically pure evil, which I fundamentally disagree with. I get their logic behind it. What they're saying is that, look, this guy is a maniac and he's driven to take over the world. Why would anyone think he's anything but pure evil? Well, in my mind, he is the exact same as many rulers throughout human history. Cetra is not known for things like, horrible massacres and things like that. I mean, definitely could have happened, and there's probably some mention of it in stories, but he's not portrayed as an evil tyrant. He's portrayed as a very good king. Yes, he was a conqueror and an egomaniac, but he was a good king. That's why he had such a long-lasting reign, and why his priests did try and preserve his life. So Cetra, to me, is a lot more grey and morally ambiguous. Like, yes, he is ego-driven and wants to conquer. Sure, I get that. But I think portraying him as outright evil, that's fundamentally misunderstanding the lore, I think. I do also find it very interesting that they talk about things like the steam tanks, and here's where I start to raise a very cynical eyebrow. Because they're saying, well, the steam tanks are a relic, and there was only ever 12 steam tanks is a myth. The steam tanks of the time of old Warhammer Fantasy battles, like the 8th edition setting, the time of Karl Franz, they're a relic from centuries gone by, and they're greatly reduced in number. This is their heyday, and what they're saying is they're no longer a relic to be revered and studied, they're a shiny new product. Basically, steam tanks are coming to plastic, would be my guess, and they're going to be bloody everywhere. Or at least things like the steam tank. They're going to steampunkify the setting a little bit, would be my guess. Because why would you go out of your to have multiple sections talking about just this thing? By the end times, it was commonly claimed there are only 12 steam tanks built ever, but that's the kind of mad myth spread in the end times. Really, there were loads of them. That was just normal. This isn't an age of vast crowds wandering through the Empire and flagellating themselves. Which is another interesting thing, because they're saying that they basically treat in this article, and they talk about it openly. They treat the coming of Savar Karl, the end times champion before Archaon, the guy before Archaon. They treat him as pretty much the Horus, and this is his Horus heresy. And Archaon is much more like the competent version of Abaddon, who achieves his goals. And they're saying that he causes a regression in technology in the Empire, and this all happens due to the fall of Prague, and all of that happens in this time period. Which I think you misunderstand the setting. Like, and this is just personally, I could be completely wrong in my take here, but the whole point of like Magnus the Pious reign and Karl Franz and all these good emperors was that like technology is on the up and up in the Empire. They're not regressing backwards. They're not going into a dark age. They are in the Renaissance period, and their technology is improving. You know, they are not getting more and more crazy and superstitious. There are superstitious people and flagellants in the world and stuff because magic is real in this universe, but otherwise it's very similar to, you know, historical human time periods. Very sort of 30 years war-centric is where I see the sort of technology at least in the Empire. And it's also interesting because they talk about the things like Empire handguns. They could give the Empire soldiers older style handguns with more primitive firing mechanisms because they're setting this in a different time period. But since they'd function mostly identical in the game, then they just want people to use their old armies and expand upon them without having to worry about such models. I don't think that's really the charitable... I'm going to be cynical here and say I don't think that's the charitable move that they say. I just think they didn't want to sculpt new handgunners. The handgunners that they have for the Empire range now are not that old a sculpt. They were one of the last sort of 8th edition sculpts that we got for the Empire. The handgunners box. I think they just like, yep, that mold's new, it's in good condition, why make another one? Yeah, sure, just use the same things. They function the same on the tabletop. So they're not going to go to like wheel locks or matchlocks. They're going to be the same flintlock rifles. So at the same time as they're saying that, yep, it's definitely regressive in tech in the area of things like handguns. They've got more steam tanks than ever because of not Leonardo da Vinci. That's Leonardo di Miragliano. I just think it's a confusing mess here of trying to use this article and this fluff, this writing that they're doing to basically explain away the business decisions that are going on in the background. And that's fine. Let's just be honest, I think, those who are watching the video, let's be honest and say that that's what's happening. They want to make a plastic steam tank kit and they want it to sell in gangbusters, so it's not going to be a rare option anymore of 0 to 1 in Imperial Army. This thing is going to be like a rare choice and you'll be able to get like a unit of 3. You know, something like that. I can definitely see them doing that. And they're not going to change things like the old handguns because, well, you know, we made a die for that right near the end of 8th edition fantasy. That die's hardly had any use. It's still good to go. Let's just use the same models. Why sculpt an entirely new model? Let's just tell people it's because we don't want them to replace old models. But at the same time, the very next sentence, the College's magic will not feature because the colleges don't exist at this point, which is true. Therefore, the Celestial Hurricanum and Luminarch of Hysh won't be there either. So they are removing models in the very next sentence. You see, and that's why I think it's corporate speak. They can't tell you at the same time as we want you to use your old miniatures and we're getting rid of old miniatures. It just, and one's for fluff reasons and the other is for fluff reasons. You know what I mean? It's reading through the lie. And it's not a kind of lie that's meant to hurt us, by the way. It's just a... You know, corporate has decided this is what's healthiest for the system, seems to me. Go down and talk about the Tomb Kings and then Bretonnia. And something I noted in Bretonnia was that they talk about the mixed and match heraldry, and they very much talk about it here. In the old days, Bretonnian armies were presented with mixed and match heraldry, which tied into our old ideas that every single knight of the realm had their own independent castle, and they all came from over the dukedoms to join battle together. What we wanted to do was consolidate how Bretonnians worked a little. A Bretonnian army where every model wore different personal heraldry was really a aspirational image that you'd see in White Dwarf and Army books, but as a hobby project, it was easy to run out of steam on. This is true. So it is a pain in the butt to do all of that heraldry. And I want to point out as well, there are excellent third-party retailers out there, like Perry Miniatures, who sculpted a lot of the Bretonnian range that there is now. They produce their own plastic ranges that are, I think, a pretty good scale. Some might disagree, but if I was building a bulk Bretonnian army, this might be the way to go. Check out some of the stuff over on their website. Like I said, these guys are the old school guys who actually sculpted all the Bretonnian range back in the day, so, you know. Anyway, the heraldry can be a pain in the butt to paint, and I get running out of steam partway through a project. But the thing with Warhammer Fantasy Battles is it's a slog no matter what, because you have to paint a lot of models no matter what. It is not uncommon to have 4 or 5 20-man infantry blocks. That's 100 models right there. You're playing Bretonnia, you're probably going to have 2 men-at-arm blocks, a couple of blocks of longbowmen, so there's probably about 80 infantry, give or take there. Then you're going to have 3 or 4 big blocks of knights. So, yeah, you get used to it, is what I'm saying here. And, yeah, it's cool to have this colour scheme where everyone matches, but I think that's incorrect, especially to the time period. This is an earlier version of medieval Bretonnia. This is the lower Middle Ages, not the high Middle Ages. And heraldry, if anything, would be, in our real world, on its way in, as opposed to super widespread. But why is heraldry important? Well, heraldry is important because what it symbolises is that, hey, if you look over the field and you see a guy and he's got a certain coat of arms, you know, hey, don't kill him, try and capture him. Because then I can ransom him after the battle for a bunch of loot. That's the idea behind the heraldry. And it's also so you can mark out different figures, people who you might have a grudge against, be recognised at tournaments, family honour, lineage, all that sort of thing. So it very much serves an actual purpose in an army. If you're going to remove all the heraldry and have it so that, oh, well, there's an overarching lord and everyone just wears their colours, I don't think you understand how the feudal system works. Now, again, I'm getting a bit real world here. I understand it's a fantasy setting game, but just bear me out, let me air my grievance here. In the feudal system, the idea was that the lord, or the knight, whoever this noble is responsible based on the amount of land generally they own, the amount of net worth they have, of bringing a certain number of people and armaments to the battle. They are not responsible for arming their troops necessarily. People have to find their own. That's why you have such a weird mishmash of equipment in the Middle Ages. Because, well, peasants can't all afford a sword. A sword's expensive, but they can afford something like an axe or a club or a spear. And so they'll rock along with their own equipment. No lord is going to buy them uniforms. They would rather buy them practical equipment on the battlefield. And people may argue that, well, it's good to have a single uniform that everyone's wearing that can be recognised. This is true. But do you know when a widespread single uniform worn by an entire army working under a certain general really started to take place? That's around the time period of the New Model Army. So the 1540s, the English Civil War. 1640s. 1640s that's sort of later than, technologically, than when the Empire is set. So for me personally, I think the whole, we just wanted to paint one lazy army scheme because it's easier to hobby. I get it, and I agree that it would be great to have that one scheme to easy hobby, but it doesn't gel with the lore of the universe, and well, frankly, you're going to be painting tons and tons of models anyway. Why not just enjoy it and paint the unique different colour schemes along the way instead of painting the one colour over and over again until it gets very boring, you know? What would make more sense to me is to pick sort of a key few colour schemes, like say 10 or 12, and replicate those 10 throughout the entire army, because that would represent the little groups of soldiers that have each been brought along by a different knight. And they could represent the knightly household. Like, those are my squires and retainers. And I've brought them along to battle. And, you know, the yellow knight with the stag's head, he has, you know, 10 footmen in that unit over there with yellow armour and stag's heads, whatever it might be. That would make more sense to me, personally. So, those are things I know. Speaking of, with these different factions and colour schemes and things like that, when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy Battles, there are going to be armies which are easier to get into than others. Bretonia straddles that line between Horde and Elite Army, and it basically comes down to what knights you include in the army. But you're going to be painting a lot of human miniatures, and human-sized miniatures. Same with the Empire, although the Empire will have war machines. They'll still have things like cannons and mortars and stuff like that in this time period. They're just going to be maybe slightly different rules to reflect the more primitive nature of the weapons, which have identical models. That's fine. Then you've got armies like the Beastmen here. So the Beastmen is a Horde army. So are the Orcs and Goblins. That means very high model counts and a ton of painting. Because if you're playing a 3,000 point game as someone like Bretonia, you bring 80 infantry and maybe 40 knights along, that's 120 models. How many models do you think a 3,000 point Beastman army is going to have? Yeah, you're going to take up a few points with some Minotaurs, with some Dragon Ogres, a Shaggoth, you know, maybe a Cygor, something like that. But most of your army is going to be Ungors, Bestigors, Gors, Pestigors, whatever they might be. Corngors, you know, and hopefully some Slangors, some sick, sexy Slangors. That's going to be a more pain in the butt army to collect. Same as Khemri. Khemri, at least, with contrast paints, things like that, you can now hit them all with a coat of Wraithbone, and then use Dark Oath Flesh, watered right down, mixed with thinners, whatever, over the top of the Wraithbone, and you'll be able to paint a Khemri army very bloody quickly using that method. But you still got to build it all. You know, so keep in mind, some armies are going to have a lot higher model count. Whereas Forces of Chaos, for example, Chaos Warriors, they're a lot easier. Usually 2 or 3 big blocks of Chaos Warrior infantry, couple, 3 or 4 units of Marauders and Knights making up the rest of the army. Quite elite, much smaller army for Warriors of Chaos. And Dwarves, and High Elves are sort of that mid-range, very similar to Empire Man. Wood Elves are, they need some new sculpts done for things like their archers and that. I think the Wood Elf Warriors need a newer sculpt, but they are a very paint-intensive army. I think I would personally like to do them if they don't give my Chaos Dwarves some love, because I've got a fun little Chaos Dwarf army. I've got a Hellhammer Sue in there, and you know, all that cool stuff. So, yeah, whatever they do with the Wood Elves, I'll be very interested to see. Anyway, that's some thoughts today on this article. But go through, I encourage you, read through it yourself and just ask yourself if you agree with some of the decisions being made in the lore and the setting, if you agree with the logic behind them, or if you're like me and you think you can see an ulterior motive. And again, that's not to tell them they're bad people or in a bad company. It's just, let's be honest about what the intent is here, because if you can tell what the intent's going to be, you can tell the direction of the system and how player-friendly it's going to be as a system. And I'm very mixed at the moment on that. So, yeah. Anyway, that's it for me. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.